Nikki, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be doing this, and thanks to you, to Abby, to the board, and of course Pegasus for recording this as well. And we look forward to this session, and as well as our next two. On November 2nd, we will have John H Garabedian, who was the founder, creator, and operator of a radio station here in Natick, WGTR, which started in 1972 and is actually still licensed to Natick, even though none of these towers or facilities are located here now. And in December, on the first Saturday of December, Rich Wayland will be with us, and Rich will have a number of stories and remembrances to talk about in regards to his teaching career and his interest in weather and so many different aspects of Natick. But today we are delighted to have Erica Rickyball join us as we start Natick Remembers. And she has a great history here in Natick and has been involved in a number of areas that have been established in Natick. Among them, running for Selectwoman herself as the first person to do that as a woman, and also being involved in a number of other initiatives that carry on today and are part of our overall legacy. And Ricky, of course, has originally lived in Austria, and her family was escaping from the Holocaust and came to the United States. She went to Brandeis and graduated from there, met Jay in 1958. They got married, and 1959 moved to Natick and has been involved in a number of different activities. 3 sons here in Natick, and has a great family history and has been in the same house for 60 years. So Ricky, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time. We greatly appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I'm honored to be here and to be your first interviewee. And you told the whole story. So.
Not at all. Just scratched the bare surface here. So tell us a little bit about your coming to the United States, and I'm curious as to whether those first years in growing up and your family being able to come here after being interned and so forth, has that influenced your life in regards to coming here and the opportunities that have presented themselves to you and you have brought to the community here?
Well, it certainly has. In retrospect, as I look back on my life, having, as you said, been born in a country that was invaded, even though they call it the Anschluss. I was born in 1937, and Hitler took over Austria in 1938, and we were very lucky to be able to flee in the end of 1938. We were again lucky that even though we were turned down by America, by India, by China, all those places that we applied, we were able to get into Trinidad, which is an island off the coast of South America, which at the time was a British Crown colony. And we, amongst many other Jewish families, got to Trinidad. There were about 1,000 Jewish families there at the time. And when the war between Britain and Germany started, we were instantly converted into enemy aliens because we came from a country with which Britain was then at war. So we were all interned, which meant being put in a camp, barbed wire around it, guards there, and I have to say, it was not a concentration camp. It was more benign than that, but nevertheless, it was not a vacation place. I had a sister who died in the camp of malaria. There wasn't enough medical help for the people who lived there, and we were released at some point. I'm not sure how long we were in the camp. It could have been close to 2 years. And, but we recovered the internship, and we did well in Trinidad until 1946, when my mother's sight started to deteriorate, and we needed to come to America for medical help for her. And we tried to get into America, but we were assured that our immigration visas would hold if we came for the medical treatment. And when it came to it, we were denied legal entry, much the same as what's happening today. And it took 11 years before I became a permanent resident. I came to America when I was 10. When I was 21, I married my wonderful husband. He is American citizen by birth, and I became a permanent resident by virtue of having married him. We moved to Natick in 1959. We married in 58. We moved to Natick in 59. And 2 months later, our first son was born. And we brought him to our house at 11 Russell Circle, where we still live today. And our other 2 sons were also born there. And Natick became a home that I had never had. Before I lived in this house at Russell Circle, I think we'd moved 13 times. And I never dreamed that I would be able to live in one place and to enjoy it and to build on it and to be in any community for that length of time. I did go to Brandeis on scholarship in 1954, and in 56, I went to a folk sing at Harvard, and with some friends, and who was there but Jay Ball, playing his guitar. Very handsome young Jay Ball, and wonderful singer, wonderful guitar player, and I noticed him right off. He tells me now that he noticed me right off, too. I was the right height, for one thing. And he said I looked pretty good then. So I came back for another folk sing, and he came back for another one. And lo and behold, he invited me out. And the next year, I saw a lot of him. And by February of that year, 57, he proposed. Took me a little while to say yes. But by Thanksgiving of 57, we were engaged, and June of 58, we were married. Coming to Natick was sort of an accident, because I was pregnant with David, and our lease was not being renewed, because while we were in Europe on a belated honeymoon, tenants in the apartment said that we had sublet it, which was against the lease. That was not the case. It was Jay's roommate, who had been living in his car, who we said, look, the place is empty. Why don't you come, stay here, take a shower here instead of at the Y, and great, everybody's happy. But we lost our lease, and we had no place to go, and David was due in 2 months. So we drew a circle around where Jay worked, and within 10 miles of Bolt, Baranek, and Newman, that's where we were going to look for a place to live. And the comptroller of the company lived in Natick. So we came out one Saturday, and we looked around where he lived in Wethersfield, and there were a lot of signs on the lawns. And so inside of 2 weeks, we got a house, and we were moved in on September 3rd, 1959. So we had a 60th anniversary this September 3rd.
That's great. So your time in Natick, you weren't here very long, and you started to notice the housing developments. You started to notice growth in schools and other
Well,
kinds
I
of
tell
things.
you,
didn't
in
you?
retrospect, there was a book written by a past chairman of the Historic Society, by Jim, help me with his last name.
Jim Morley?
Morley.
Oh, yes.
In which he analyzed that period of time from the early 50s
Right.
or late 40s, the end of the war, to around the 70s. And it really gave some insight into what was happening during that time. There were, in 1953, Wethersfield was started, the section of town that I live in, north, that abuts Cochituate and Weston and Wayland. And that was a huge tract of housing, a couple of hundred houses. The same thing was happening off Hartford Street, that housing, Sherwood, the Pelhams. There were lots of tract housing, single-family homes that were being built to address the demand of returning soldiers who were starting families, and the great spurt in the economy at that time, so that Natick all of a sudden had huge demand for schools. The Murphy School, which is no longer here, the Bennett Hemingway School, the Liljer School, the Brown School, all of these elementary schools had to be built to accommodate that baby generation that all of a sudden was springing up all around Natick. Right. And the people who had lived here before in the late 1800s and the early 1900s and during the war, they saw themselves as the native Natickites. And all these other people coming in from outside, they were the carpetbaggers. And all of a sudden, the needs of those carpetbaggers was so pressing that all these schools had to be built and all kinds of infrastructure had to be done. And the taxes, they went up significantly. And the local people, they resented it because of the suddenness and well, you know, some growth I can understand would be easier to, you know, accommodate. Yeah. But so much growth all at one time, pretty much, over a decade, let's say. And so there really was a schism in the town. And a lot of the local people, they were, in the beginning, they were bedroom people. They came here, they had their children, they raised them in Natick, but they worked elsewhere. They didn't work for the town, which a lot of the local people did, whether it was DPW or whether it was the schools or the fire department, or right. They formed the town employee core of the community. And all these other people, they may have worked in town or they worked, you know, someplace else other than Natick. Because Natick industry used to be the shoe industry, and that had vanished during the war years. There wasn't, you know, that didn't really exist anymore. And so that there was a real transition. And we who came in, as I say, the tail end of the 50s and in the 60s, and the 60s were a turbulent time nationally, not just here in Natick. And so there was no welcome mat was out there for
Right.
us. And I think people sort of felt everything was in turmoil in the country nationally, so you didn't have a luxury of sort of settling in locally. Right. And, you know, having what it used to be the welcome,
yeah.
what was it?
welcome
the
wagon.
welcome wagon.
Yeah, mhm,
Yeah, I
exactly.
remember she did come to the house, but I mean that wasn't the norm, you know. So it was quite a time, and it took a particular kind of urgency maybe on the part of some people who said, I'm not going anywhere, I'm staying here, this is my home now. If you wanted to get involved, you had to make an effort. And the thing for me that was the saving grace was the League of Women Voters.
Yes, yeah.
And we had a very strong and active league. I remember the first president I knew was Fran Pillsbury, who lived on Dover Road and who had the League of Women Voters. I mean, we were, I would say, close to 150 strong at that point. And it was through the League that I got to know Natick. I got to know the people that studied it, that cared about it, that really, really were meshed into the history and the present and the future of the town.
Exactly. And from that, you became president of the League from 67 to 71,
Yes.
and that was part of your springboard to 1975,
I have to
right?
inject something personal here. In 1967, our family lost our middle son.
Yes.
And it was a traumatic experience for the family, for me, and it continues to this day. But at that time, I was elected president in June of 67, and I fully intended to serve. And in August, my son was killed. And it was questionable as to whether or not I would, in fact, take on the responsibility of being the president of the League. And I'm so grateful that I was able to rally myself enough to, in fact, do that, because it was my lifeline. In retrospect, it was the thing that saved my sanity and focused me onto a good future, something that I could build on, something that I could invest my emotions, my anger, my fear, my love, all of those emotions that one has at such a time. Natick became the object of those feelings. And I'm so grateful that I had that. Otherwise, I would be at McLean, or maybe I wouldn't be around.
And with strong family, Jay, of course, and
My
your
husband,
two sons.
my husband was and is my rock. He postponed his mourning to underwrite, to support our family. He paid personally for that. But he has been the rock of our family. In many instances, when something like that happens, either the family breaks apart or the family pulls together. And I'm so grateful. I thank God that our family pulled together. And that's due in no small measure to my husband.
Right, exactly, exactly. So you were able to pick up these pieces
Yes.
and have Natick as kind of a catalyst to be able to move forward.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
so in the years between there and 1975, you built on community involvement and through the
Absolutely.
League as a real focus in that.
In 1967, some of the issues that the League was interested in, we worked on state government, on changing the term of the governor from 2 years to 4 years, something that succeeded.
Yep.
Also in cutting the size of the House of Representatives, which we did, to 180. It was 200 and some odd, I forget the number. On a local level, we worked on education, on ensuring support, full funding for education. We also worked on housing, on fair housing. Natick had the first fair housing committee in the country, which did things like testing when an apartment was offered to a black family, then it wasn't available, it was already sold. And then a white family went to the same realtor for an apartment, and oh yes, we have something for you. Let me show it to you. And so this was a very important role that we had in housing. We also looked to provide affordable housing. Remember, this was something that was ahead of its time. Unfortunately, we weren't as successful in that area, but we worked at it. The other thing we worked at, and it was the catalyst for my running, it was to establish a floodplain bylaw in the town to assure that housing would not be built on areas that were subject to 100-year floods, that were subject to flooding in general. We wanted to protect the wetlands and the floodplain because we understood their role in the environment, and we did not want to inject housing into those areas. Well, that passed town meeting, and we were very pleased. And the very next Selectmen's meeting, the Board of Selectmen at that time appointed the attorney for the largest owner of wetland land in Natick, the Sunkaway. And it infuriated me because it was clear that they were snubbing their nose at the bylaw that had just been passed, and there was no intention to enforce it. And so that's when I decided that, you know, it's great to study things and it's great to put in legislation, but unless you have people who are dedicated to enforcing the law, you will not succeed. And so that's when I decided to become more of an activist and run for office. I think we have the same situation now. We have laws on the books that people in power are thumbing their nose at, and it's time for each and every one of us as individuals to become activists, to make sure that the laws are in fact enforced and that we have a genuine democracy.
Advocacy never ends, does it? It's
No, it
always a
doesn't.
continuous thing.
Every generation has to learn, you know, the same lessons over and over again. I'm living through what I had lived through as a young person, as a child, as a young adult, seeing people who are mistreated because they are immigrants, who are treated unfairly because they don't know the rules of the road, who are denied access in spite of what is international amnesty law. And I thought we were done with this. And I'm living through it all over again.
Right.
It's time for us all to be activists.
In part of your activism, of course, you decided to run for the selectmen.
Yes, I did.
And how did that go, especially being the first woman to do that? And how much resistance did you receive and support toward that end?
Well, I have to say, it was a very exciting time. And I had gone to a course at Boston College for Women in Government and Politics, headed up by the National Committee woman, Betty Timor. And that was in 1974. And it was a wonderful course trying to get women to see that they had a genuine role in the public life of our democracy. And it was through that course that I was encouraged by the other members of the course and by what was happening here in Natick to run for office. The people of the league said, you know, this is what we work towards, run. So I did, with the encouragement of my husband and the wonderful support he gave me, making my signs, keeping track of the volunteers, and I had an awful lot of support. And I had a public presence as president of the league, so I think that I had name recognition out there.
Yeah.
And I think after the turbulence of the 60s, there was a feeling that it's time for a woman to take her place on the Board of Selectmen.
Right. Yeah.
I had fun with my name. We had a lot of things like get on the ball with Ricky, or Ricky's not just one of the boys, because I was critical of some of the procedures and some of the policies that were coming out of the Board of Selectmen. And so it was a fun campaign. It was really a first in many respects. And when I won, it was thrilling, absolutely thrilling. Getting on the board, though, was slightly different. I was the only woman, and the men sort of resented my intrusion as they saw it.
No welcome wagon there.
No welcome wagon there. I think they resented the fact, they felt inhibited, that their language had to be cleaned up, and they resented that. They felt that that I was a nitpicker, that you know, some of the things that I felt needed to be changed were restricting, and they didn't see the value in when I said, let's say we had an appointment to make to the Board of Selectmen, to something in the town, and the Board of Selectmen made the appointment. If it was on the agenda, that was good. But even if it wasn't on the agenda, the chairman would bring it up. Oh, we have an appointment for this and so. And they might just, out of a hat, bring up a name and say, what do you say to thus and so? And they would push it for a vote. And, you know, I felt that there should have been a nomination, and it should be posted, and people should, this was before the open meeting laws, and this was before a lot of those procedures were in place, and I felt that the people should be interviewed, and then we should take a vote. And they didn't like that. And it took several iterations of this kind of confrontation between the board and myself to establish that as a procedure, because I made it uncomfortable for this, you know, well, my cousins are thus and so, why don't we? And Wiggy White had 40 cousins, we all know that. So that became a procedure. Things like, I'm trying to, that kind of transparency and visibility was something that was new to the board. And as I say, they resented that.
Right. But you had 3 terms on the board, and you did a number of things while being on the board that were very notable today, including town charter changes, hiring the first town administrator.
Yes, we did.
And also a process for hiring the first legal counsel, and also in regards to land for the Natick Organic Farm of today,
Well,
among other things.
Those things that you point to were all things that either I initiated or got involved in. When it came to the town council, That was an issue that was a major battle for me because we had a local town council who was sort of like a mom and pop store. He was local in his experience and I felt was too closely tied to members of the board, and that I didn't feel there was the requisite distance between a counsel and his client that would allow for objectivity. And so I felt strongly that we should have a firm that had different specialties, that if we needed a lawyer that would cover labor law, that we would have somebody there. If we had someone who, we had a real estate issue, that we would have someone there. And also that distance, someone who did not have any conflicts of interest because he had a local practice and there were members of the board that could either influence his practice one way or the other. Yeah. And that was a long battle that took over a year to settle. In the end, we had two members of the board who were for the local council, two members of the board who were for a different town council, and I was the swing vote, and I voted for an out-of-town council. And I stuck to my guns, and eventually they gave up the battle, and my council got in. But what I did not know was that they would gang up and then make sure that the council who was hired had no staff, no office, no files, that they stonewalled him, much in the way as we see now on national television. They stonewalled that attorney for 4 months, and finally he said, you know, it's impossible to do my job. I think I will, you know, give up this position. And eventually the firm of Murphy, Lamoureux, and Murphy was finally hired, and that's the firm we have today. That firm has been on the job for, what, 35 years? And, but there has been many changes in personnel, and we've seen how that has functioned over the years, and we are in the process currently of revisiting that issue and looking at the whole town council representation. So that was one big battle.
Absolutely. Two quick things that continue on. The neighborhood bus, of course,
Yes.
into Metro West Regional Transit, and also the Natick
the farm.
extended day, as well as the farm.
Well,
Too.
the farm way back belonged, well, I guess the town had the land, and we had a committee back in the 60s that was very concerned at that time with drug use and abuse and the impact on our young people in the community. And so there was a committee headed by Bob Brack and George Ames, and that committee felt that giving young people a productive way to use their time and to inculcate better goals and habits into many of the young people in our town was a way, was to create a farm that would give them places to spend their time and constructive life lessons. And so the Board of Selectmen turned the land, which is now the Natick Community Organic Farm, over to this committee, and that evolved into the farm. And it's one of the very best things that we ever did. And I think given the, it's become a model in the state and in the country, and it is a thriving enterprise, and many generations of young people have benefited from its existence. Right. As for the neighborhood bus, that is a particular favorite of mine, because when I came to Natick, I didn't drive, I didn't have a license, and I had a brand new baby, and I lived at least a mile from anything. I lived at the far end of Wethersfield, and there was no public transportation. And when there was an experimental bus system, there was an experiment from the state, monies given to communities for experimental bus systems. When I got on the board, I said, I want to work on that. And I did. And I ran into trouble right away because the idea to get this bus system in place was to provide a public-private partnership in order to support the bus system and to be eligible for the grant from the state. So we wanted to demonstrate that there was in fact public support for this system. So I went out, and in 3 days, I'm pleased to say, I was able to raise $10,000 from businesses who wanted to see this business in place. And I brought that to the Board of Selectmen before we went to town meeting. And at the time, one of the selectmen, I don't know if I should name him, but he's no longer here, so Peter Garland, he was infuriated the fact that I had done this. And the board then sent me a letter of censure that it was inappropriate that a member of the Board of Selectmen should solicit funds for this kind of an enterprise. Well, that didn't stop me. I went to town meeting. We got the vote. We showed them that the public was behind them, that the state was prepared to make the grant, and that town meeting should, with the infusion of some local money, support this enterprise. And over the years, during my 9 years on the board and afterwards, there were numerous attempts to cut back on funds, either by the state because it was in shortfall or by the town. And finally, we got it into the town's operating budget. And now that there is an MWRTA, which is the larger regional authority that is supported by the state, we have folded the Natick Neighborhood Bus into that system.
Right.
So it has a wider reach, and so Natick is still covered, and we have an additional $100,000 that's been set aside for the Natick Connector. That's only for Natick, not for the surrounding towns, but that is here for the use of Natick residents. Mm-hmm. So I'm thrilled to see something where I was there at the birth, to see it grow up to be a grown-up.
Exactly, exactly.
So,
two other quick things that are not so quick, but I want to make sure we get in. One is your passion and involvement and commitment to housing-related issues. You were appointed by then Governor Michael Dukakis to a housing board, and of course you've been on the Natick Housing Authority now for some time as well.
8 years, I think.
Let's talk a little
Yeah.
about how the growth has been in the housing, and you touched on that earlier, of course, in regards.
Well, back in 1976, I think, then Governor Dukakis appointed me as the Selectmen representative to the State Housing Appeals Board. That was composed of a selectman, a city councilor, a mayor, representatives from the constituent communities in which housing is being, affordable housing is being challenged. And the Housing Appeals Board is that state body to whom a developer goes if a local community denies him or denies that developer the opportunity to construct affordable housing in that community. Back then, the opposition, I mean, this was a first. And so that board was much more in use than it is currently. 40B housing is not a strange title to most people. It's been in the news, as I say, for 40 years. And since that was established at a state level. And the appeals board allows a developer to have a hearing, to present his case for development to this board. And they then decide whether or not the community is being restrictive, overly restrictive, and whether or not they are in fact excluding low-income people from their community. If, for instance, there is a community that has 2-acre zoning, and there are still some such communities, and I think there's one, most particularly Weston, that's right now fighting this particular case because there is a developer who wants to build some significant number of units in Weston, and I think they have 2-acre zoning. Now, 2-acre zoning automatically excludes houses of value, let's say, less than $1 million.
Right. So,
And nobody can afford that who's looking for affordable housing. Right. So just by that zoning, they automatically exclude a whole spectrum of housing. And so that appeals board served the purpose of making that judgment. If in fact they decide that the development is a reasonable development and that that community is using their existing zoning to exclude the average person, then they can make a judgment in favor of the developer, and then he can go ahead with his development in the community, disregarding the local zoning.
yeah, yeah.
And that's a significant change. And the law requires that 10% of a community's housing be able to be classified by the state standards as affordable. And we in Natick have been able to be above that threshold, which means that 40B housing developers cannot come and impose their version of what's being built. Now, it's up to us as a community to be proactive and to keep abreast of whatever new construction is happening to make sure that we have at least 10% of our housing be affordable. And that's why, for one thing, I've worked on the Natick Housing Authority. That is subsidized housing, not affordable. That's subsidized. That's for the elderly and for people who cannot afford market rate housing. Affordable housing is market rate, but at the lower price point. And we in Natick, with the Affordable Housing Trust, where my husband is very active, and I try to stay abreast of that as a member of the Housing Authority, it's important for us as a community to maintain a good balance of what's available in housing stock. For a long time, we fought multi-units in Natick. We wanted only single-family homes. Then we finally got the notion, yeah, we need some apartments in Natick for our people here in Natick. We need some units that are within walking distance to things. We need housing for those people who want to downsize, people who lived in the family home for 50 years and now there are only 2 of them, or maybe now there's only 1, but they want to stay in Natick. Right. They don't want to go somewhere else. Do we have housing for that kind of a person? And so we need to look at the housing needs of the whole community, not just the housing of any particular neighborhood.
Exactly.
In my neighborhood, it's being mansionized. I don't know who's going to live in these $1 million houses now. And I worry that there are seniors, people who are in their 60s, who want to live on one floor, who won't be able to afford the houses in my neighborhood. So we all have to look at the town as a whole and the needs of all the people in our community. But we are part of a bigger community, and we have to be mindful of that, and we have to be welcoming.
Absolutely. Good comments all. I want to mention something else that's near and dear to your heart and work, and you and Jay have done so much in regards to the Center for the Arts in Natick, TCAN.
Well, last night I was at TCAN, and we went to a concert by Tom Rush.
Yes.
For those of you who are not folk music aficionados, Tom Rush was a member of the folk revival back in the late 50s, early 60s, and he continues all these decades to play wonderful, wonderful folk music. And he's grown with the times, but the feeling of the folk music is there, even though it's a new composition. But what I wish is that I could carry the feeling and the spirit and just the whole climate of TCAN last night and bring it to you so you could feel what it's like. I am a very proud mother of TCAN.
Right.
I was there with Mike Moran at the very first, when it was just an idea, something we wanted to do. We went around looking at Kemp's Bowling Alley, which is no longer there. We went to the center school, which we wanted for the location. That's no longer there. That's a parking lot. We went all around to places. Where could we start a coffee house or a place for live music? And I remember when we had a storefront, 2 doors down from Debson is where we were. And I remember the early days of TCAN. I remember going there after 9/11 and sitting there listening to Anya Minogue, a wonderful Irish harpist, and crying because I was so relieved that after 3 days of watching the towers fall down, I finally could go to a place where I was free of it. I didn't have to see it again, and where I could reassure myself that I could still recognize and feel beauty, where I was still human enough to feel beauty and to get away from the horror that was happening all around me. And that was TCAN. And I've experienced that again when, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, there was a production of Tuesdays with Maury, in which my husband played Maury,
Yes.
and my son, an equity actor, was brought in from Chicago to play Mitch. And that play
Yes.
had us laughing, had us crying, had us so moved that when my son made a request of the audience, he said, "One of these days, I want to be able to make this request for help for the ALS Society," and someone in the audience will say, "What is ALS?" Tuesdays with Maury was about a Brandeis professor who had ALS and who died from it. And the play was so moving that with 3 asks after each performance, we raised $3,600, And the following Monday, we went to the ALS Association and gave them the check. That's the power of local community involvement, the way in which we were able to express profound feelings, to do it as a community, to do it by amateurs and professionals, and to provide something special that had there not been a TCAN, that opportunity would have been lost. If you go today and look at the art exhibit that's there in our hall today, in our lobby, I encourage you to go there and see the work of Carol Krentzman. She is a wonderful mosaic artist. But in our lobby, you see the totality of the things that she has done. Not just the actual artwork that's up on the walls, but beautiful, beautiful interspersements, descriptions, and pictures of the other things. It's like a beautiful book with some of the real artwork in between the pages. It's a lovely exhibit, and it not just promotes, but it encourages and displays a local artist's work, so much so that she has received a grant from the state to do a special chair for the Edward M. Kennedy Senate
Museum.
Museum.
Yeah.
And we have a really special talent here in Natick, and we have an opportunity to display for the local residents. You don't have to go into Boston to see something of her work. You can see it right here. So that I think that, and I would be remiss if I didn't point out one volunteer effort that TCAN afforded our family. When we bought the building from the town for $87,000, mind you.
The fire station.
Yes.
Yeah.
Other communities got their fire stations for $1. We paid $87,000. But one of the conditions of the purchase was that it be restored to its original historic appearance. And that was a condition of the state grant that we bought as part of the purchase. We got a grant from the state, from the Historic Preservation Grant. The part of the building that had not been restored by that time was the cupola,
Yes.
which I think was lost in the 1938 hurricane. I'm not sure of that, but I think it was. At any rate, we didn't have the money at that time. We had estimates for that cupola restoration anywhere from $80,000 to $160,000, depending on what quality of materials. If you wanted to put real slate up there, it would cost you X dollars. If you wanted to put a synthetic that looked like slate, it would call you X minus dollars. So that we didn't have the $80,000, but we had the contract that said you had to do this, otherwise you forfeit. So we started a volunteer project. We got a donation of $1,000 from Home Depot for the work on the cupola. My husband undertook the restoration of the cupola. We had had a board meeting at our house at the beginning, and we discussed the issue of how were we going to do this cupola. And the question was, do we know what it looks like? Do we know what it's... Yeah. And they said, well, we have one original drawing. And my husband saw the drawing, and he said, well, we could do that. And he said he volunteered to do the project. It is the most wonderful volunteer project I have ever seen, except for the one that he did in our synagogue by redoing the whole synagogue. Yes. And we have a book here that you can see how he did that. But on this cinema, you can go to, what's the name of it, Jay? On YouTube. You can go to YouTube and look up Tican Cupola, and you will see a video of the whole, it's a 9-minute video, not lengthy. And you can see the volunteer project, the people who were involved, the people who did the actual work. It's done to wonderful music, and it's a wonderful, wonderful experience. But suffice to say, with the help of an anonymous donor who agreed to match every $2 that we raised, he would put in $1, okay? With donations from Obie Hill, from the son-in-law of James Lavoie, who was the president of the Middlesex Bank, who did all the ironwork on the very top. We had people who donated the exteriors, the shingling, the flashing, a lot of what went into that building. We were able to present a check, mind you. It didn't cost TCAN. We presented a check to TCAN for $26,000 for this cupola, and we satisfied the conditions for the sale to TCAN by the town. It was the most miraculous and inspiring kind of effort. We had one gentleman who was a friend of someone on the board who had cancer and who came in, didn't know anything from TCAN, but he was a friend of someone who worked on it. And he came with his hammer, and he worked through his illness. It was a therapy for him to work on this cupola, this community effect. And in writing about it in the paper, we got a check for $500 from the owner of Dunkin' Donuts. He had read about this community effort in the paper, and he sent an unsolicited check for $500 to support this wonderful effort. So TCAN has been a blessing throughout all its years in so many ways. We have people who have lost family members, who've become volunteers, who are the staples of our box office, people for whom TCAN has become a second home. For me, it's certainly one of my children, one of my beloved children.
Right.
And I've spent 21 years taking care of it. And I just want you to know that we are at the point where we're going to celebrate a 21st birthday for TCAN. And at that point, we want to be able to say, there is no more mortgage, we own it outright, and we have the money to take care of it. That amount is $150,000. You out there, help us take care of this baby.
And it's been such a success. And of course, a movie theater and so many talented folks that have gone through there to show their
We have
their
so
art.
many, we have a whole new generation coming to the movies.
Right.
Who didn't know us when we were just a folk music hangout. So
Much more, yeah.
now you can come and see first-room movies and documentaries and all kinds of things.
That's right, exactly. You can see, folks, why the town annual report was dedicated this year to Jay and Ricky Ball for all of the things that they have done, have been involved from the beginning to make some of Natick's history what it is today, and are continuing to do into the future. And Ricky, we greatly appreciate your being able to share this hour with all of us here in the audience, as well as with Pegasus for future airing as well.
I just want to say, as a last note, I was labeled homeless. I was labeled displaced person. I was labeled enemy alien. and to come to Natick and feel at home, feel that I am accepted, feel that I have been respected, to feel that all of you are my family, that I am no longer homeless, I am no longer displaced, I am no longer an enemy alien, I am a citizen of Natick, and I love you all. It's a sincere and grateful thank you.
And thank you. Thank you very much, Ricky. A real pleasure.
Thank you very much.